As someone who studied hadith in both traditional and academic settings, there tends to be a tension between the two. Sometimes those in the West, they look at traditional ways of approaching hadith and they view it as bias or that some kind of oral tradition that's just passed down with, hearsay. And it's viewed as, unacademic or it's viewed as an unscientific method. In the West, there's this portrayal that the way they study hadith, because they're quote unquote outsiders who don't have a skin in the game. They approach it quote unquote objectively. And this is not necessarily the truth. Every person has bias. Every person approaches a topic with something. So someone, for example, who doesn't believe in religion is going to approach a religious topic from a place of bias, right? From a place of viewing, trying to disprove religion. Secularism or atheism is not a place of neutrality. It's a place of starting, right? It's a point of starting that there is no God. And some people, they assume that this is a place of neutrality. So when Western scholars approach hadith, they often approach it with biases and with flaws, although it's portrayed to be objective. Today, I'm going to walk through a case study of a particular way that Western scholars study hadith to show that it's actually full of assumptions. So this work I'm about to go through is that of a scholar by the name of Joseph Schacht. Joseph Schacht was a Western hadith scholar who maybe had the most influential impact on the way Westerners or Western academics view hadith. He was a American-German scholar who wrote a book called Mohammedan Jurisprudence. He wrote others, but Mohammedan Jurisprudence is his book where he lays out one of his ways, not all of them, but one of his ways of determining whether a hadith is authentic or not. So here, Joseph Schacht, he says that the best way of proving that a hadith it did not exist at a certain time is to show that it wasn't used in a legal argument that would have made a reference to it imperative. What he means here is basically that if there are two scholars who are having, let's just say, a fiqh debate, let's just say they're debating about salah, whether you should raise your hands after ruku' or not. If the scholar who is saying you should raise your hands doesn't use a hadith that says you should raise your hands, then this, Joseph Schacht is saying, is proof that that hadith didn't exist. Because why else wouldn't he have cited it? It was supporting his case. He says this is especially the case if a later scholar of that, or a student of that scholar, let's just say, for example, Imam al-Shafi'i, he's debating someone from the Hanafi school, and he says you should raise your hands. And he doesn't say a hadith that says you should raise your hands. But then a Shafi'i student comes and he says that you should raise your hands, and here's the hadith. So now Joseph Schacht, he says, hey, this is proof because Ash-Shafi'i did not use this hadith. He had a doctrine, he had an argument, and he didn't use it to support his argument. So now a Shafi'i student comes and he makes the same argument, but now all of a sudden a hadith appears to support this argument. So he says this is evidence that the hadith was fabricated by the later student. Otherwise, Ash-Shafi'i would have also quoted it. This seems to make sense at face value. However, as we will see, there's a lot of assumptions that are being carried in this. Before I get into those assumptions, I just want to kind of walk you through an example. So here we have Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, who died in 96 Hijri. He was the teacher of Hamad, who was the teacher of Abu Hanifa. Let's just say that Ibrahim al-Nakha'i is making an argument, and he doesn't say a hadith, and Abu Hanifa does. So what Joseph Schacht is going to say, he's going to say that the fact that Ibrahim al-Nakha'i didn't cite this hadith is proof that it didn't exist in his time, and it must have been fabricated somewhere at Abu Hanifa or right before him, maybe Hamad, right? He will say either Hamad or Abu Hanifa fabricated this hadith, and then they projected it back to the Prophet ﷺ to support their legal doctrine. And this is again an approach where, for example, Muslims, they will approach this topic with immense reverence for someone like Abu Hanifa or Hamad or Ibrahim al-Nakha'i and these scholars. They could never imagine that such a person would lie. However, someone like Joseph Schacht is projecting onto them the idea that they would fabricate things against the Prophet ﷺ. So initially, the Muslim and the academic or the secular person approaching hadith are looking at these two people in completely different lights. One of them sees them as a person of integrity, another views them as someone who will easily lie to prove a point in an argument or make a legal case. So we see here that an earlier scholar doesn't say a hadith, and a later one does, which Joseph Schacht says is proof of fabrication. However, this doesn't always work because sometimes the tables are turned. Sometimes a earlier scholar will say a hadith when a later one doesn't. So, for example, we have a debate between the Malikis and the Hanafis about the best time to pray Fajr in congregation. Is this time when it's still dark, a little bit dark during Fajr, or is it when there's some light? The Malikis, they say it's better it's dark, whereas the Hanafis, they say you should pray in congregation when there's some light. And we have this case here where Imam Malik, he wrote his Muwatta, and Imam Malik died in the year 179. So Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, who is the student of Abu Hanifa, he writes a Muwatta as well, and he dies 189. So he comes after Imam Malik, and he definitely wrote his Muwatta after Imam Malik, and he kind of followed similar methodology in that. So Imam Malik actually cites the hadith in his book, Al-Muwatta, which supports the Hanafi position. It's against his own school, right? Imam Malik, he came first. He cites this position, which is against the Maliki school. And then we have a Shaybani who comes later, and he writes a similar Muwatta, but this hadith is removed. So we would say then, what is the reasoning behind this? Why does this show that hadith, just the lack of citation of hadith is evidence of the scholar not knowing it? In this case, Ash-Shaybani, he has every reason to cite this hadith because number one, it supports his school, which goes against Joseph Schacht's argument about why people make up traditions to support their school. And number two, he knew this hadith because it's quoted in one of his other books called Al-Hujaj. So this is an example of how sometimes if you turn the table about when hadith are cited and when they are not cited, it doesn't make sense. So there are several reasons why scholars will cite a hadith or not cite it. And here are some of the assumptions that come with Joseph Schacht's argument. So again, Schacht was saying that if a hadith is not mentioned, therefore it is fabricated or therefore non-existent. So he's making an argument from silence. Silence means that it did not exist. To give you an analogy, let's just say that you look at your parents' pictures, right? You look at an old photo album and you're looking at their pictures. And all of the pictures you see from, let's just say, from when you were 1 to 7 years old, you weren't in any of those pictures. And then suddenly, after you were 8, you're in all of the pictures. The argument Joseph Schacht is making is that you didn't exist in this family until you were 8 years old. The lack of evidence of you being in pictures, the fact that you were not in any of these pictures, shows that you were adopted at 8. This could be the case. However, there are a million other reasons why you were not in those pictures. It could have been that your family, they lost those pictures of you. Or it could have been that you were a child who just didn't like pictures. Or it could have also been that every time the family took pictures as a child, you happened to not be there, right? There are many reasons. There are many assumptions that are being made to make such a large claim that you were adopted at the age of 8. So similarly, Joseph Schacht's argument has very strong implications because it leads to the dismissing of hundreds, if not thousands, of hadith based on an argument from silence. A lack of mentioning does not mean a lack of existence. So here are just some of the assumptions that come with Schacht's approach of an argument from silence. Number one is that he believes this assumption is that there must be a complete citation practice, meaning that every time there is a legal point or every time there's a fiqh argument happening, that the scholar cites everything that he knows. And this is definitely not the case. Sometimes scholars, when they speak, they are speaking to another scholar, so there's no need to always cite the verse or the hadith because that scholar knows exactly which hadith they are referring to or exactly which ayah they are referring to. The fact that he's speaking to a scholar and him mentioning, oh, this verse says this verse says that, this verse says this, is kind of repetitive and pointless because the other scholar knows that piece of evidence. So Schacht's argument assumes that legal doctrines were recorded with their supporting hadith, and this is not the case. There's another problem here is that Schacht is looking at fiqh works for hadith documentation. and fiqh books and are not places where hadith were preserved. They are just places where scholars are making legal arguments. If you want to look for hadith reference and hadith documentation, you will look at hadith works, not fiqh works. Another assumption that Joseph Schacht's methodology carries is that this idea of universal knowledge, that if a hadith was known to one scholar, it should be known to everyone. So let's just assume, for example, that Imam al-Shafi'i didn't cite the hadith, right, that I gave in the beginning, the example, the raising of the hands. And let's just say that Imam al-Shafi'i didn't know the hadith. There's a possibility he didn't know it. This does not mean that other scholars of his time did not know it either. Just because a Shafi'i does not cite a hadith to support his opinion cannot be projected onto everyone else, all scholars of his time, as a sign that they also don't know it. It could be the case that there's a hadith in Iraq, right? A companion went to Iraq, he moved to Iraq, Ibn Mas'ud, for example, and he narrates a hadith that was not narrated in, let's just say, Syria or Medina, and the hadith may be known in one region and not the other. So hadith were not perfect preservation where, like in modern times where, if you have access to something, you put it on the internet, everyone has access to it. That's not how the world works, right? Or worked at the time. Another assumption is that scholars, they have flawless memory, that someone like Imam al-Shafi'i or any person could not forget a hadith. It's actually very possible that the scholar forgets a hadith. And even Imam al-Shafi'i, he did mention in one of his works that he says something along the lines of, I did not, there are a hadith that I forgot, and therefore I don't cite them. It's also possible that the scholar knows the hadith. However, he doesn't cite it because he doesn't believe it to be authentic. It's not strong enough evidence for him to cite. Or the hadith in reference for him is not evidence. He doesn't see it as evidence. Someone like Schacht may argue from his own perspective that this hadith should have been cited because it's definitely going to support his case. But maybe the jurist, the faqih, saw that this hadith actually doesn't support my case, it weakens it. So therefore, he doesn't cite it. This is another reason. And then finally, there's also this idea that there's comprehensive writing, that a scholar, when he was making an argument, he wrote everything that he knew. Even Abu Yusuf, who is the teacher of, or the senior scholar in the Hanafi school after Abu Hanifa and before Shaybani, he has in one of his works where he's making a legal argument, and he says, "Lawla tul," had it not been for that this would become very lengthy, I would have included many more references. So sometimes a scholar does make a point, and he does make an argument, and he doesn't say every single hadith because it would have taken too much space and too much time, and the hadith that he mentions are sufficient. So here we see that Western scholarship approach to hadith, and Schacht in particular, are not as objective as they appear to be. He calls this one of the best ways to determine whether a hadith is authentic or not. But actually, we saw that this is not some kind of airtight, rigorous way of approaching hadith or history in general. There are many biases in this, and there are many assumptions that he makes when studying history, simply from a historical perspective, simply from a way of or a methodology of studying history. If you approach any tradition or any history with this approach, an argument from silence, there are going to be many mistakes made. And I gave the example of you being missing from the pictures, your family pictures, right? There's that assumption is how holds a lot of weight, that you were adopted or that this hadith did not exist simply because it was not cited by this person or that person. So although Western scholarship has this image of being objective, it's actually not as solid and methodologically rigorous as it makes itself appear to be.